Hey there, and welcome to Chapter 6. We're going to be talking about qualitative research, which is, if you look at the beginning of our chapter, or excuse me, the beginning of the book, we've talked about two different types of research. We talked about qualitative and quantitative research, where quantitative research is where we use numerical data, and qualitative research is where we use, to simplify it, words or pictures, things like that, non-numerical data. That's the way we kind of define the data we use in qualitative research. So when we do different types of research, oftentimes we'll find ourselves as researchers a little bit painted into a corner, pigeonholed, if you will, because you have folks that just identify as quantitative researchers, and you have folks that identify as qualitative researchers, and most of the research they do will fall into that category. They may vary or stray out every once in a while, but most people will pick one path out of grad school, and that's what they do for the majority of their career. Excuse me. So myself, I'm sure I've mentioned before, I'm primarily a qualitative researcher. That's where I find my wheelhouse. And so the research that I produce, it deals with non-numerical data. It deals with, why would we want to, first of all, why would we want to analyze data that's not numerical? If we want to say, what is the correlation between crime rates and the lowering of sentences, we could look at that numerically. We just look at how many crimes have been reduced, their sentences have been reduced, and how much crime was there afterwards. It's a very easy mathematical formula. We see that if there's a correlation or not. We produce the research saying yes, there was some sort of correlation. There's some sort of relationship between this number and this number. But if we want to look at that a little more deeply, there's a lot of reasons why we would look at that qualitatively instead of quantitatively, instead of just looking at the numbers. We may want to find out, like, why? Why is there a relationship? What are the people experiencing that's causing that relationship? So your book goes into several different bullet points as to why we would justify a qualitative study. And I got them here. I'll go over a couple of them. First one is just to shed more light. Just like what I was saying, the idea of, like, sure, the numbers say this correlates with this, but we want more light about that. We want to have a deeper understanding. Or maybe we thought that if we lowered crime rates, that we could eliminate people in jail, staying in jail too long. For instance, the Do Cops Still Care study that we referenced earlier. The impetus for that study was it was sold as a program to reduce the jail population, prison population, actually. So if we reduce the sentences for drug crimes, then we can reduce the number of people that are in jail for drug crimes. That was we don't want people in jail for addiction, was how it was being sold. Well, what we found out in that study was there were some unintended consequences. Nobody considered the fact that police officers were going to change the way they did business. So the numbers would never have shown that. Sentences lowered, less arrests, less jail time, very numeric, very black and white. But what we ended up studying was those unintended consequences, finding out that we never would have found out that officers changed the way they did business if we didn't look at more than the numbers. So that's why qualitative research is so important. Another rationale that your book talks about is just getting that thick, rich description. That's a very common term in qualitative research, thick, rich description. We don't get that from numbers. We don't get in those black and white, is there a relationship? We only get that when we look at what people tell us, the rationale, the whys, those descriptions, those lived experiences. Only those can show the why as far as things happen. So, excuse me again, I'm not going to go over every bullet point, but on page 208, you can see a lot of those rationale. But how do we get those? How do we get those thick, rich descriptions? How do we get the data that is not numeric? And we get it just from talking to folks. We get it by interviews. That's a very big part of qualitative research. We conduct interviews with participants. And because they're interviews that are sometimes 30, 45, 60 minutes long, we can't have populations. We talked about a sample size last week. Our populations, and thereby our samples of those populations, have to be smaller. I cannot interview effectively 1,000 people, but I can survey 1,000 people. So qualitative research can have a much larger sample size. In fact, that quantitative research can have a much larger sample size, but qualitative research has to be smaller. I can only interview so many people in a day, especially if those interviews are an hour long, and then it takes me another hour to go over the transcripts and correct any of those transcript corrections that need to be made. It takes hours for each interview. So another way that we collect data is through focus groups. Again, just talking to folks, but this time just talking to them in groups. We could just watch people. If I wanted to conduct research on the culture of law enforcement, maybe I just do a bunch of ride-alongs with police officers and just watch them, and I take notes. Those are non-numeric data notes. I could send out some online short answer questions that are kind of like interviews, except they're online. But I'm probably not going to be asking one word questions. I'm going to ask open-ended questions, not closed-ended questions. I'm going to ask try to get as much data as I can, as much description as I can, pictures, documents, things like that. Those are the types of things we use in qualitative research. So that gives you a little bit of an I guess, introduction to qualitative research. Look over your chapter. We're going to discuss that for the rest of this week, and your assignments will be based on that chapter. And the next week, we're going to get into quantitative research, which is the numeric side of things. So, as always, I look forward to hearing from you. If you have any questions, please reach out to me. And until then, rock chalk.